The Who Let the Dogs In is not the name of the song. It's Who Let the Dogs Out. Hope everyone knows it, and now we'll have it playing constantly in your brain for the rest of the day. But this is not is going to relate to dogs in shul, but will also relate to the idea of how we look at a shul, a synagogue, a sanctuary space, through the prism of the particular question of allowing guide dogs in shul. And that will relate to a larger topic of kavod beis hakneses, the idea of the honor that we provide and the respect for a shul, as well as the way shuls probably have changed from the first times they had shuls till today, and how they're utilized and what they're utilized for, and see how sometimes sometimes the fact that new issues emerge. Is this something that should get the halacha to also change itself, or different approaches to it change themselves? So let's dive in. And of course, as usual, this is our Remarkable Responsa series. So we're looking at it through the lens of some of the responsa of the past generation or so. It's kind of complicated. What's considered a generation? If Rav Moshe Feinstein is writing in the 50s, is that almost 100 years ago, a generation ago, 2 years ago? Probably depends on where you sit. I think of at least the 1980s as contemporary. People who were born in the 21st century think of it as ancient history. So the term is loose, but really I would call these modern questions. I think we can use the determination that we had a couple of weeks ago with electricity. Electricity was an issue that was never dealt with until 120 years ago. Okay, so that's new from a religious, from a halachic standpoint. So source number one is from Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, and it was talked about someone who used b'inyan suma shehergilo kelev laholicho im yachol lichanes lebeis hakneses letfila. A blind person had an eye dog, a seeing eye dog, that was allowed to bring that seeing eye dog into shul. And the question was dealt with in 23rd Shvat 1950. Tafshin Yud Gimel, probably early 1953. So he's writing to Pinchas Mordechai Teitz, going on Bez in Elizabeth, New Jersey, the famous Rabbi Teitz from Elizabeth, New Jersey. Hinei b'davar hasuma asher limduo la kelev laholicho, a blind person that would be able to teach the dog to accompany him. Umuchrach hakelev lios tamid, so the dog always has to be with him. Im yakol lichanes lebeis hakneses lihispalel b'tzibur, can he come into the shul so that the blind person can daven with the community? The dog doesn't have to daven. You want him to be able to come to shul, to be able to come to shul to participate in all the things that require a minyan. Or is this denigrating the sanctity of the synagogue, which is modeled after the Beis Hamikdash, and this is a small temple? So we know that the shul does have significance and has sanctity and sacredness that is required. And so the question is, how do we look at bringing a seeing eye dog, right? Is this for the person to come to shul, so that's what you need? Or is it that you have certain objective standards of sanctity that can't be broken regardless, right? Sometimes it doesn't work. So a couple of sources, and these are those that Rav Moshe Feinstein and others will deal with in the course of their deliberation. One is from the Yerushalmi. So the Yerushalmi is talking about the idea that one may not behave unbecomingly in synagogues and houses of study. One neither eats nor drinks in them, nor takes walks in them, nor sleeps in them, nor enters into them because of the sun in summer, because of the rain in winter, but one studies and preaches in them. Right? This seems to address synagogues, houses of study. No eating, no drinking, no hopping inside to get out of the rain or to get out of the sun. You daven, you learn, period. Yes, you with the cup of coffee in front of me. We're going to be talking about you right now. Rabbi Imi commanded to the teachers, if a person comes to you who is dirtied by study, accept him and his donkey and his implements. So Rabbi Imi was approached by those who seemed to violate the rule. someone who might not be so shul appropriate or study hall appropriate, or and is told, maybe even have his animal with him, and Ravimi says you let him inside. So there seems to be kind of a ideal, and there seems to be a reality in this Yerushalmi. So maybe you only let donkeys in, maybe disagree with Rabbi Yimi, but this Yerushalmi talks about an ideal of sanctity of the synagogue or the study hall, and the recognition that not everyone's going to be up to snuff. Gemara and Megillah, 28b, source 3, and one may not adorn himself inside them. You're not allowed to do anything inside a shul that is not shul related. Rava said the prohibition applies only to lay people. But Torah scholars and their disciples are permitted to do so. Wait a second, there's a two-tier system. As Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, what is the meaning of the term Bey of the sages, describing the study hall? It's a shortened form of house, Beta of the sages. In order to facilitate the constant presence of the Torah scholars in the study hall, it is permitted for them to use the hall as though it were their home. So this is the idea where we are discussing Beis Medrash, Beit Midrash, the study hall. It's used for davening, it's used for learning, but it's really the house of the rabbis, the house of the scholars. So the students, the scholars, those studying to be scholars, this is their home. We give them more flexibility because how are they supposed to develop as scholars if you make them go outside every time they take care of a specific need, or to have a sip of water, or to take a break, or the like? So you have a certain an extension of the idea of a more familial environment, which is the Beis Medrash. Now, the idea we call things synagogue, we call it sanctuary, we call it study hall, but really what we're seeing in these two sources is that there's a concept of an ideal sanctity for synagogue and house of study, but you have to be a little more tolerant. That's source number 2. That's Yerushalmi. You also see that there's definitely a distinction between sanctuary and study hall. Beit Knesset, which has a higher level of holiness, and a study hall for the sages, for the students, that they can take a little bit more flexibility because this is their home. So when this is understood from a practical halachic standpoint, and in a sense, there's sometimes the merging of the two, because not every synagogue, not every community had a synagogue and a study hall. Sometimes they merge into one. We're sitting in a Beit Midrash right now, but we also daven in it. Right? Next door to us is a sanctuary where we have classes in it. So that you don't always have such glot specific separation. So you have the idea that the Magen Avraham presents, and this is in the Shulchan Aruch when he's talking about the sanctity of the synagogue. And he talks about Lachein mutarin lecho v'lishos sham dim yitzarchu leich b'chol pam lecho v'lishos bevesam yispat lu milimudam. He says if people are studying there, then they can take a drink or have a snack. Avol im ein lomdin beis hakneses. If you're not learning in the shul, maybe he uses the shul terminology. Asur lecho v'lishos sham. Right, the what? How can you say the student it doesn't have to respect the sacred places? So we see that that practical Jewish law recognizes that there could be certain exceptions made, but really only within the context of one's worship or study service. The idea that you're not supposed to treat it just glibly as a social space. That's the rule of a synagogue and a study hall, the ideal, the reality, and when engaged in religious worship, we consider those participants allowed to take certain liberties, like have your cup of coffee. But if your mind wanders, don't sit, because then you're not learning and you're drinking. There you go. Now, just to touch briefly upon, there seems to be a cultural distinction between Ashkenazim and Sephardim. Ashkenazim generally, the Europeans, the Yekis as an example, are very proper. They follow the rules. When it comes to Sephardim, very often in their synagogues, besides the fact that there's always breakfast after davening, not in the sanctuary, but the food, there's always food. A lot of times you see them coming in more commonly than Ashkenazim with a cup of coffee. And this is something that somewhat is not really addressed, because really the rule is that certainly in the morning you're not supposed to eat or drink before you daven. We make an exception if you're not going to be able to daven without eating or drinking something, that we make allowances. So, when this issue gets addressed, it's not really addressed directly by some of our older sources. When it gets addressed nowadays, it seems to be a combination of, if someone's eating or drinking or bringing a cup of coffee into shul, it's probably because they need it so they can focus on their davening. And it's incorporating what we're seeing here, that if you're a worshiper or a student, we allow a little more flexibility. I would say that, kind of following the strict letter of the law of the procedures, we don't want any eating or drinking in shul, even during davening or the like. The study hall is a little bit different. People spend hours, studying Talmud. Allowing them to have a drink would facilitate that. So I think he's finding the distinction that sanctuaries, we prefer keeping them clean, both clean because bringing food and drink, it gets messy, but keeping them pristine of physical pursuits. The study hall, we make certain allowances. Certainly, this is only when you're there for religious purposes and not otherwise. Questions, comments before we move a little bit further into the changes or sources which govern our behavior in shuls today, and then go back to answer Rabbi Moshe Feinstein's questions, see his view and others.
Rabbi, isn't there a famous story where a rabbi told his wife, I think, she's very, very, very hungry, and they said she should eat first, otherwise she won't be able to concentrate on davening?
Sure, we recognize that. The question is that a reason to allow bringing it to shul?
Right. Big difference.
So I think that we're seeing there's some flexibility. Some of it would seem to be taking too much flexibility. For the most part, we have, we seem to have loosened things up, and I think the next couple of sources, I think, contribute to the momentum and how things have loosened up in shul and in study halls. Also explaining kind of the almost everyday occurrence of bringing a cup of coffee or something to drink into shul. Look, nowadays you have, even the Baal Koreh will have a bottle of water. Now, part of that is technically required. On the other hand, it would seem to be that's the most sacred moment of the service, to have something there that doesn't belong. So again, there's a need. We're not there to oppress anybody, but sanctity sometimes means we have to aspire to move beyond our physical needs, right? Like Yom Kippur. Right? Yom Kippur is not necessarily about punishing ourselves. It's about uplifting ourselves to go beyond the human needs. So yes, we've seen that. We've seen that. To help, we've seen to be that there's an aspiration and a reality. That was the Yerushalmi. We've seen that sometimes there's a need in the Beit Midrash. So, and we've seen that that's recognized by Jewish law as allowing for, or looking the other way, and not necessarily always requiring a food, beverage-free zone of shul and Beit Midrash, as long as it's for, quote unquote, a good religious reason.
Might there also be a balance between, strict kedusha of the base Knesset and balancing it between having people feel comfortable and making sure they actually do come to shul?
Comfortable pews. Have you ever sat in a traditional wooden pew? Comfortable. Nowadays you go to the movies, you have those reclining chairs with cup holders on two sides. We introduce that into the shul maybe? No, so there's that idea. And look, when we talk about, respecting the synagogue, there's kavod, right? There's just courtesy, and there's Mora HaMikdash, what's called. Mora HaMikdash is this idea of reverence, right? Part of that is the idea of, why there's opposition going to Temple Mount today. This idea of reverence for the space is that you really can only go there in the right mindset, in the right level of purity, etc. And some of the opposition to going there is about, are you going to places which you're forbidden to go? And some of them is a general, like, wait a second, how can you just be going there? Are you really in the right mindset? What's your motivation and the like? So I think there's a recognition of the reality, and I think that definitely is from the Yerushalmi, right? Rabbi Imi, if the guy shows up and he's not really synagogue worthy, still let him in. Okay, once, I spent a lot of time in a congregation where if you showed up in a yarmulke that was not the standard issue, they replaced it, right? Or if you wore brown shoes, you were not welcome on the bima. there's a certain, there's a dress code issue also, and there's a balance. But I think, all things equal, we're not encouraging the cup of coffee in Shul based on what we're seeing so far, right? If it happens, it happens. If it's necessary, it's necessary. But there's a certain aspirational behavior for Shul and study hall. Now, there are a few things that I think contribute to the more familiarization that we have of wanting to feel more comfortable, and that entering into the consciousness of halacha along the lines, Herschel, what you're suggesting. Because you have very famously source number 5, also from Megillah 28b. Rabbi Asi said synagogues in Babylonia are built from the onset with a stipulation that they not have the full sanctity of a synagogue in order to be permitted to use them for the community's general needs. But nevertheless, one should not act inside them with frivolity. So there's a certain idea here that shuls they're not what they used to be. They were mikdash ma'at with all of the accompanying stipulations, regulations, and aspirations, and now not exactly the same way. There's this tanai. What does this mean, tanai? The idea that we're building the shul, and it might not always be a shul. It might come down, it might be sold, right? This came up very often, especially in a lot of the urban synagogues as the communities moved away and they had to sell the synagogue space. How do you sell it to a church? That was an issue also Rabbi Feinstein dealt with, and a lot of communities dealt with. And very often the room to allow selling a synagogue or letting it get used for other purposes comes from this principle introduced by the Gemara here that is built on stipulation. These are not permanent synagogues. These are not permanent sanctuary type spaces that require the full carbon copy of the sanctity of a temple, for example. And so when they talk about doing things in a shul other than davening or learning, that's where it comes from. And like for example, even having kiddush in a shul. Now, many congregations, synagogues that we're used to, right? Certainly, the bigger shuls of first half of 20th century America were built with kiddush rooms. Right, I remember my shul growing up. There was the sanctuary, there was the beis medrash, there was the kiddush room, and there was the social hall. Right, the social hall was only for big kiddushes or events. The kiddush room was the small space where the typical Shabbos davening. Right, we're used to these types of multi-space congregations, but that wasn't really the case, in days of yore, previous centuries, previous generations. You had the shul, and it was kind of like the one-room schoolhouse that everything was taking place in one space. Well, how do you end up having a study hall and a sanctuary? And remember, the whole idea, one of the rituals that we're familiar with, the idea of making kiddush and shul on Friday night, which was done for the visitors, where they sleep in, right? If you have a kiddush room and a social hall, and you have other spaces, but they were sleeping in the shul. They were, so there was kind of a need to explain how our synagogues became community centers when a synagogue can't be a community center. And that's where you have Tanai with a stipulation built in. And while the stipulation may have been out of necessity in previous generations, it's kind of, we've taken it as a prerequisite, almost as we look at our shuls that way today. And that also can create the more familiar, comfortable, carry the cup of coffee into the sanctuary. Nowadays, not carrying a cup of coffee to sanctuaries because the synagogue has a rule they don't want it to spill on the carpet or the pew, more than respect for the reverential. So you have that, which I think is contributed. Then you have something that is in source number 6 from Gemara and Brachos, where Rava introduces the idea that the synagogue is like one's house. Just as one objects to a person using the house as a shortcut but does not mind spitting and wearing shoes therein, so too in the case of a synagogue, the shortcut is prohibited while spitting and wearing shoes are permitted. Right? Some people today are shoe-free homes, but right, the idea is there's a rule you're not supposed to use a shul as a shortcut. And so if you're passing through a shul and not praying there, they suggest you study something or say a pasuk, say a verse, so that you've used it for some sacred activity. But the idea this is, it's like one's house. Right? It's not looking at the walking through it as intrinsically wrong. It's just like at your house. You don't want people cutting through your house to go from one place to another. In my mind, anyone see the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off? At the very end, he's trying to race to get there ahead of everybody else, and he runs through someone's living room, He runs through the backyard. Hey, how you doing? Right? People don't expect that. That's why it's so memorable. But the idea of yeah, you wear your shoes. Now spitting it harkens back to a different time and a different place where spittoons were not uncommon in the synagogue. Right? We talked about some of these laws a couple years ago. When we talked about using the shul as a pickleball court, so the idea of, again, like one song, if you're comfortable with people doing it at home, they could do it in shul. And so this too changes our behavior towards the shul. As we become maybe more flexible in certain things in our homes, we've allowed certain things, more things in our shuls. And Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik actually invoked this text as one that really can direct our behavior towards issues of synagogue behavior. And according to one approach in the name of Rav Lichtenstein, this was how he approached the guide dog situation as well. But we'll come back to that when we look at Rabbi Moshe and those who opposed. So the other issue that in source that gets mentioned with regards to this in terms of how to utilize, how to look at a shul is, how to facilitate the desire that people have to come to shul with some of the standards of behavior that would keep them out of shul. And here, this is something that the Ramah talks about in Orach Chaim with regards to coming to shul, and it has to do with the idea, in particular, has to do with women who are nida, who are in their state of impurity. Right? We know that there's a certain aspirational purity that everyone has. Nowadays, ritual impurity as a practical matter is mostly found in the laws of family purity in terms of women who are nida and post-nida, right? Post-menstruation, going to the mikveh. That's where we find it as a practical religious matter. It's a custom. Men go before Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. Some go more often. But in the times of the Talmud, going to shul was a function of purity. And men would have to go to the mikveh if they were impure. In particular, had to do with what was called Takanat Ezra, Ezra's rules of aspirational purity. And for example, a man who had a seminal emission would have to go to the mikveh before going to shul. The Talmud says that this became impossible to follow, and it was batel. We don't really require it, but it still makes its way into the halachic conversation, even if it's not mandated. And the Ramah mentions that there were practices that, even if we got rid of Takanas Ezra for going to shul for men, there were some, right? And he says, there are those who wrote that a menstruate woman in the days when she sees blood may not enter the synagogue or pray the Amidah or mention the name or touch the Torah scroll. That the idea of impurity was still relevant, and those who were halachically impure, or in particular seeing blood, those women couldn't go to shul or kiss the Torah. And there are those who say that she is permitted in all of those, and that is the correct opinion. He says there's another view that allows this, and he says that is the way to follow, right? So just like the idea, just like we kind of eliminated any of the thresholds for purity for men, the same thing is with women. Everyone can come to shul, right? But some would say that women not coming to shul in the same proportion as men, part of that was their lifestyle, but part of that also was this hesitation on the ritual purity matter. Ramah says, remember, Ramah's writing, in his place in Poland, it doesn't matter, that should not be an impediment. But he says, the practice in these lands in Ashkenaz is according to the first opinion. Even though he accepts that everyone can come to shul, and even women who are in a state of impurity can come to shul, that was still the practice. Women didn't come to shul. And in the clean days after menstruation, before immersion, is permitted to do those things. Even among those who women didn't go because they were impure, only if there was the period of the days of menstruation itself. And even a place where they're stringent, and let's say a place women didn't go to synagogue when they were quote unquote impure, during the high holidays and similar days where many assemble to go to the synagogue, they are permitted to go to the synagogue like the rest of the women, for it would cause great sadness for them, for that all are assembled and they stand outside. So there's this idea that even when there's a ritual reason not to go, when everyone's going, we open the doors from a religious perspective and find leniency and let them come in. So there we start off by saying that there's an aspirational holiness in the sanctuary and in the study hall, but you sometimes have to make allowances, right? That was the Yerushalmi. Then we talked about the idea of that when engaged in religious activity like the Torah scholars and the Beit Midrash, we should let them have a little liberty, because if you make them go home for a drink, they're going to stop learning, and then less Torah is studied. We saw that these distinctions and these levels were accepted halachically. We saw that with the Magen Avram. If you're davening and if you're learning in the synagogue or the study hall, it's okay to eat and drink. We saw that the way we approach our synagogues today, Al Tanai with a stipulation, may have loosened our standards of behavior. We saw that also the synagogue is like one's home, just like home behavior and standards change, that may change the way it works in a shul. And now we're also seeing not just the place, but also making allowances when people really want to be there. We can sometimes lower the religious thresholds for participation. And even though sometimes people would be excluded because of their ritual purity status, on days when everyone's going, we lower that threshold. So Rabbi Feinstein weaves a lot of this together in source number 8 in his conclusion with regards to guide dogs, seeing eye dogs in shul. Lachain kiven shebeis hakneses chamor chazina shelo gara leachila ushtia ushina. We let the donkey in. Remember, going back to the Yerushalmi, we let the donkey enter. That's certainly eating and drinking. So certainly synagogues that are built on stipulation, especially if it's extenuating circumstances. Certainly the dog is better than a donkey. And there's no better extenuating circumstances than this. He'll never get to go to shul for these things. There will be days that it will be very difficult not to attend, like Yamim Noraim, the high holidays. Right? He invokes our Ramah in 88, source number 7. So tell me someone has a seeing eye dog that's always with him. To come to daven, to hear the Torah reading. You don't want it to disrupt the tzibur. Right? We want to have sensitivities to everybody else who may not be as comfortable. So that's Rabbi Moshe Feinstein taking the sources that we saw, applying it here. So not everyone agreed with Rabbi Feinstein. Rabbi Yaakov Breish saw this, and he has source number 9, a responsum written hasagos. He has his criticisms of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. Now, anyone think of a critique that just stands out in terms of Rabbi Moshe's rationale? We're a little bit more lenient. Al Tanai, it's necessary. He really wants to go. So therefore he needs a dog. Let him come. Can anyone poke a hole in that before we look at the Chelkas Yaakov?
Maybe assume it's butter mitzvahs.
Okay, so maybe he's exempt from the commandments, so therefore we shouldn't make this exception, or we shouldn't lower the standards. Okay.
Maybe his proof from the Ramah is like that was just stringent, meaning that was just
okay.
There's no real reason.
Okay, so it's not apples to apples in the situation. So maybe you can't bring a raya. Could be. So let's look inside.
What other people want to bring their dogs? Is that the problem?
Oh, okay. So maybe you give an inch, people are going to take a mile. Okay. All right. So I think I think Rabbi Feinstein is clearly, like we said on the outset, that these are situations that weren't really dealt with before. That you could imagine, the original sources about donkeys in shul were not really welcome. So you don't want to make an exception now because we never made exceptions until now. So it's a bad precedent. So let's see.
And they're too reminiscent of Bilam as well.
So there is a whole discussion, the whole idea that there's the mention. Hirsch, you should know the pasuk. Esnan zono mechir kelev. The Torah has a very specific rule that anything that's the outgrowth of anything that's any mitzvah that's purchased through the pay for a prostitute or dog is not to be used for sacred purposes. Now, this very much leads to, prostitution is obviously a forbidden activity, but it also leads to the negative attitudes towards dogs in religious circles. So so there's so there's that. Will that also will come up. So let's look inside source 9. This is a shock. This is livnos migado yisod ra'ua kazed. How to use these sources to build up a very bad precedent. What about the fact that the sages can, students and the sages can eat and drink in the shul if needed, right? This is also only kishadarkum lumagam beis hakneses shekem yedarkum is manashas. This has to do with the shul study hall that they had there. If the sanctuary is not a study hall, then no one's allowed to drink there. What do you mean? Doesn't the scholar or the student, don't they have to revere the sanctuary? You can't compare the flexibility we saw in the Yerushalmi to our shuls. Again, that's you could take issue with that, but he does, and he says, look, we're not making those same distinctions. We don't study in our sanctuaries, so you can't let anyone eat or drink. You can't make any flexibility. No flexibility means no guide dogs also. I was Masha Tzira Mispalin. Vada Yosmi should Mispal Bilakavana Sham Mispalin. Look at Bilbo Kavana Yosmi Zek Shom Be'em to Besa Knesses Besa Midrash Chamor Okel Avamisham. He's like, Rav Moshe says, be careful not to disturb people. What greater disturbance is there? Now, this is based on this. You shouldn't let babies into shul also, which very well could be. Shulchan Aruch talks about that. So so he says that it's a very great distraction. He's not sure the Yerushalmi, which was flexible about people who show up with their donkeys, is talking actually about a donkey. Maybe it's not the donkey that gets in, but it's the donkey leader who might be a little dirty or smell like a donkey and the like. So if you don't have any permission to bring in the donkey, you don't have any permission to bring in the dog. So then he says, with regards to dogs, real Jews don't own dogs, he basically says. Arrogant, people, of prideful people have dogs. Okay, so if anyone's ever looking to respond to their children about not owning a dog, real Jews don't own dogs, says Rabbi Yaakov Reish.
This is not a choice.
Okay. So, and then he points out something which, is pretty obvious. Ramosha says, without the seeing eye dog, he'll never come to shul. What about human beings? Why can't someone take him to shul? Right? Isn't that, why have we absolved ourselves of the responsibility to show this guy, take him to shul? So he really has no option. If no one can take him to shul, then he really is, like Hirsch says, he's patur. So there's no reason to let a dog come in. Right? So, so Rabbi Breish, has a stricter view, a higher threshold for when we can show more flexibility towards the sanctuary or the study hall in general, has a negative attitudes towards dog ownership in particular, and sees that there's really should be the onus on us to get the person to shul. And if we're not going to even step up, then there's no obligation for this person to come. So we're not going to be flexible altogether. All right. I think that, when you talk about, what others say about this, I think for the most part, shuls are showing more flexibility. They're sensitive to the idea of bilbul, about disturbing other people. But I think, as we pointed out, in terms of the culture of people being more flexible with shuls, sanctuaries and study halls, the other exceptions that are made, they're not going to stop it from the dog. They're not taking necessarily the approach, the higher threshold of Rabbi Breish. They're not as negative on dog ownership as Rabbi Breish, and we can make the allowances. So I mentioned before, Rabbi Soloveitchik was quoted as introducing the Gemara in Brachos that our shuls and our homes have, we have similar expectations, and that will govern what we allow and what we don't allow. So they quote Rabbi Soloveitchik as allowing us. And then Rabbi Schechter wrote an article about the Rav's opinions, and this is in the YU Torah Journal Beis Yitzchak. I saw a quote in an article, it's volume 31, and I actually happen to have volume 31, so I got to look inside. And he said, and so it had to do, and Rabbi Shefton describes the situation, a blind person, bought a ticket in a shul for the high holidays, and he came in Rosh Hashanah to the shul. He brought his seeing eye dog that he always had with him, and they went into the shul, and the people in the shul were upset, and they said the dog can't come in, and he came in anyway. And when they tried to stop him from bringing in the dog, there was some altercation, and they pushed back, and he fell, and he was injured. So he sued because he was injured in the shul. He sued in secular court, and the judge, and I'm translating from the article, asked that the damages depended on whether religiously he had a right to bring the dog into shul or not. Because if the Jewish law allows him to bring the dog in, and the synagogue is liable. If he's not allowed to bring the dog in religiously, then the synagogue is exempt because the altercation was provoked and it was within the context of fulfilling a religious obligation, kind of a church-state distinction. So the judge asked Rabbi Soloveitchik for his opinion, and Rabbi Soloveitchik says that according to his opinion, you can't enter with a dog into a shul. That was his opinion. Now, is that his always opinion? Rabbi Lichtenstein quoted something else. Was this to get the shul off the hook? Who knows? But it's just an interesting halachic determination that also had a certain church-state issue as well. So different opinions. Someone else who addressed the issue was Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson Lubavitcher Rebbe. And he was asked by Rabbi Menachem Kasher about the issue. Rabbi Menachem Kasher had a more strict view, and he, based on Rabbi Kasher, dealt with in his Torah Shlema. His Torah Shlema is his work where he expands upon the rabbinic views of biblical verses, and especially with regard to Esnan Zona Mechir Kelev, where the Torah is negative in terms of utilizing money that you get for a dog for any religious purposes. He says we're against we're religiously negative on dogs, so you shouldn't bring the dog into shul. So Rabbi Schneerson took the other view and was more permissive. Source 10, regarding the question of allowing a blind person to enter with a guide dog, there's another important point. The case is similar to the ruling of Shulchan Aruch 88, right? That we saw before. Women who are ritually pure to attend shul will cause them great pain because everyone else is going to shul, they will be left outside. Right? And so therefore, in the case of a blind person, the restriction would be permanent. It is obviously possible to arrange for the blind person to enter the shul with human assistance. But the point I'm making here is about whether it's important for him to begin with, either because of the pain he will otherwise suffer because of the great importance of prayer and shul. It's important for him to enter shul that we must obviously look for ways to enable this. Now, the thing which also I thought I'd put it on the sheet, but I didn't. He says, and what about other people who obviously help him? He says that's true, but that's still not enough of a reason. Is not enough of a reason to reject the blind. Right? It says obviously possible to arrange for blind person with human assistance. I do have it in the bold sentence. The point I'm making here is about whether it's important for him to begin with. So therefore, Lubavitcher Rebbe does address Rabbi Reich's opposition because someone else can help him. And he says that's besides the point. If there's a rationale for him to come to shul, there's a rationale for him to come to shul. It doesn't matter how he gets there, especially if we have precedents for lowering the halachic threshold, or we have precedents that allow for more flexibility in terms of what we have to do to honor the shul. And, so that's why we entitled this year, "Who Let the Dogs In?" Rabbi Feinstein, maybe Rav Soloveitchik, Lubavitcher Rebbe, and a lot of this has to do with changing attitudes towards shul, how we view the sanctuary, and what flexibility will allow. As well as the attitude toward shul in terms of the desire that people have to come to shul being one of those things which lower the threshold for the types of behavior we will permit to get them to come to shul in the first place. So now we have it's not just the specific issue of the sanctity of the synagogue or study hall, but it's the source of also how we look at shul and what we do to encourage people to come to shul. And you could see certain reverberations for other issues that we've spoken about. What do we do with non-observant Jews in shul? A lot of this is similar to recognizing times have changed, but we still have halachic precedents which get us for those who wish to allow greater flexibility. Personally, I kind of like the Rabbi Breish about real good Jews don't own dogs. As I like to say, my favorite dog is anybody else's, but that's more personal commentary than halacha. Everyone can follow their own local Orthodox rabbi. All right.
Maybe it's not so common. Let's see some new dogs.
Two of my kids have dogs.
They in like seeing out dogs.
No, no,